Hey, welcome everybody to the first of 10 webinars, half-hour webinars that will happen almost every other week between now and the beginning of February. We are going to be concentrating on something that is in the new 2022 proposed standards that will be fully implemented in 27-28 in Minnesota. And they are the 8 mathematical practices, and I'm going to talk about them over an 8 part webinar series. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Sara Werf, and I am the Academic Standards Specialist here at the Minnesota Department of Education. I'm happy for you to reach out to me anytime, and the link that's being shared in the chat, and I'll give a bit.ly for people as well and a QR code to do that. At the MDE, we have 10 commitments to equity. This 10-part series will really focus on number 9, which is improving the conditions for our students in their learning and creating in them the skills that they will need to be part of the 21st century workforce. The 10 sessions are listed below. We're doing part 1 of the 10 today. In 2 weeks, they're all going to be Wednesday morning at 7 a.m. So they're for all of us who are online live right now, but they will be recorded and uploaded. All the information and recording links and resources, articles, PLC protocols, folders that include anything that I can share or will share will be located and linked in this document. If you know where this document is, then you're linked to all the other stuff connected to this webinar series. The Zoom link is going to be the same for all of the sessions. So if you got here today, you can get to the other sessions as well. I'll share that link at the end of the webinar as well. When you go in there, one of the things that will be there for each of these is what I talked about is a professional learning protocol for using the half-hour recording, something to do before the recording. We did that something yesterday in the Minnesota Math Leaders group. And then also in there, if you scroll to the bottom of that document, are tons of links, articles, videos, book recommendations and other things for what could you do next if you wanted to do a deeper dive in the sphere of influence that you are in. If you're a teacher with other teachers, if you're a leader with those that you are leading as well. So thank you to all the people that are putting things in the chat. I will be available at the end of every webinar for 15 minutes to answer any questions, and that will be off the recording. So if you are going to use the PLC protocol, what you would have done prior to watching this video is you would have Googled Math Student on your device. If you have a device, you can do it quick. I'm not going to do it slowly. And then click on images and take a look at the images and scroll through a lot of images. If you did that, the question we wanted you to do was look at all those images and give evidence from the images to describe what a student looks like. Yesterday, when I did this with a large group of teachers, people said, wow, there's a lot of chalkboards. There's a lot of one students working alone. They're very puzzled. They're working on arithmetic, and they're trying to figure things out, and that's a math student. I then asked them to Google a second phrase, students engaged in 21st workforce skills in math, and do the same thing. Click on images and take a look at those images. And when you look at those images look different than the math student images. Still the word math is in there, but now we're seeing groups of students. We see the teacher as the guide. We see them using devices at times. We see them collaborating, and we're seeing a lot of different skills. I believe our biases of what we believe a math student and a math teacher to be can be found in Google Images, and many of us act amongst those. And I'm going to challenge us to think about the differences between these two sets of images. How are they the same and how are they different? As we think about what are we trying to create in our students as we move forward. One of the things you can do prior to watching this video with others is to look at those in contrast and ask yourselves, what's the same and what's the different, and do those differences matter? And then you'll come back and watch this video. What we're going to be talking today are things that exist within the 2022 proposed math standards that are currently in rulemaking. You can find those on the MDE webpage. The way I find this is I simply Google MDE math. It brings me to this page, and you click on the implementation page. And you can find our future standards and a timeline for implementation. When the committee in 2022 was writing these standards, these are their children pictured here. They thought about their children because the children of the age that you see in these pictures are the children that will be impacted in their K-12 career by the 2022 standards. And the committee was imagining what will the world that they will get jobs in, be community members in, and have careers in, what will that look like? And so they looked at a lot of research. This was just one piece of research at what are the job skills students will need in the future. And guess what? None of the job skills were things like can calculate quickly without the help of a device. Because all of us live in a world now where my watch can do all the math I learned through college. And the skills that you see there are more closely related to the second set of pictures that I showed you rather than the first set of pictures. So they wrote at the beginning of the standards, and I highly recommend you read these 4 pages, a front matter, which includes the career and college and community readiness statement that gave a vision for Minnesota K-12 math students and what we would like our classrooms in math to look like using the standards that are in the document. One of the things that is in the front matter that they decided to include into our standards moving forward are 2 different dimensions. This school year 24-25, we're going to focus on the first dimension, the math practices. Next school year, next fall, we'll be working on and having a lot of professional development around dimension 2 and the benchmark contexts that are going to be in our standards. Having these dimensions overlay every single standard and benchmark in the 2022 standards models what's also going on in science. Science is being fully implemented this year, and they also have a set of dimensions that overlay this. The goal this year is for all of us to get to know dimension 1, the 8 math practices. And if you look at our new standards, and you look at the end of them, you'll see letters that say MP3, MP6. You'll see some symbols. Those symbols right there that you see at the end of every single benchmark are these notations for the dimensions that overlay how these will be used in classrooms. They are also currently being used right now by assessment teams who are writing the MCA4s in the next set of assessments to look at how that will transform items in the future assessments for our students. And so today, in the limited time that I have with you, I'm just going to start the conversation. The first part of that is, where did the math practices come from? I know some of you know where they came from, but others of you don't. And then I'll tell you a little bit about what they are and how you can utilize them. So way back in 2000, the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics released a document called Principles and Standards. Some of us in this space, me, I was in like my 9th year of teaching. We're teaching at that time, and this document came out and recommended for students and teachers 5 process standards that should be incorporated in the way that we teach math. And those still guide the work of the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics to this day. A few years later, the National Research Council put out a book, and I've linked to that in that folder of resources that I've shared with you. A book called Adding It Up. In that book, they defined mathematical proficiency. It is still the definition that's built into most classroom resources today that recommended having an equal concentration on 5 intertwining ideas of proficiency. And so those things came in conjunction with NCTM's standards. And those 2 things were built into our current standards, the 2007 standards. When the committee wrote these standards, they had those in mind, and it helped the people in our state write these standards. And at the time, in 2007, 2010, these were among the most highly rated math standards in the United States at the time. Shortly after Minnesota wrote their standards, a few other things happened. NCTM released a second book called Principles to Action. It's still a book that we use to today. This is for teachers, telling teachers how you take the standards that were in the previous books and put them into action. And they have 8 effective teaching practices. If you're saying, what is the research best practices in math? It is still to this day these 8 items. One of these 8 is going to be the focus of the Minnesota Math Leaders PLC this year. We introduced it at our meeting yesterday. If you come to our meeting tomorrow, you will hear about it then and throughout the year. Also around that time, Common Core um, released a set of national math standards. Most states adopted them. Minnesota did not adopt those standards in mathematics. And so while the rest of the country was adopting those standards, which included the 8 standards for mathematical practice, they called them SMPs. We in Minnesota, unless you were following along on social media, a lot of us did not uh, know much about those 8 math practices. Those 8 math practices over the last 10 to 15 years have been built into most curricular resources for math that you can purchase to this day. I would say of the things in the Common Core state standards, the 8 math practices are probably the part of the Common Core math standards that almost everybody agrees on. As other states have shifted and adapted away from Common Core, they have kept the 8 math practices. So when the 2022 committee came together, they said that's something we really want to add to our state math practices. These, by the way, these 8 math practices, I put a folder of resources there for you, come from the research and the thinking around mathematical habits of mind. I put some posters in there that Sam Shaw and others have shared, but there's a lot of habits of mind and there's a lot of overlap. So sometimes people will call the math practices the habits of mind that we're developing in our students. And then during the last 15 years since these came out, a lot of people have started to organize them in a variety of ways and chunk the math practices that tend to go together and play out in similar ways. We'll be talking about that in some of our future webinars as we're going along. This is from a presentation from 10 years ago that my predecessor in this job did all around the state of Minnesota when introducing the current standards that we have and doing professional development related to those, where they connected all those documents that I just said and said our current standards, and I would argue our future standards, are all based in how all of those things come together. And at the center of that is the content, our standards, but all of those other things talk about how students engage, what type of decisions teachers make, what instruction provides, and all of those things. So that brings us to our current standards. It is in the final stages of rulemaking, and in that document is this first dimension covering 8 mathematical practices. In future webinars, we'll take each of these one at a time and talk about what it is and what that looks like in the classroom and some ideas for how you can start using this with our current standards, because I am telling you that it's been talked about in our state for the last 10 years, saying, yes, these are things we should be utilizing, even though they weren't explicitly in our current standards. So if you're like, how do I prepare for future standards and current standards simultaneously? I would argue it's by really deepening your work on these 8 math practices in your work with your students. So what are the math practices and why are they important for our classrooms? I'm going to pause for just a moment and let you read this quote from Kitty Rutherford, who wrote this in a blog that I have attached from NCTM. So I'm going to pause and let you read that. I would love if you're reading this live with me, if you would put something in the chat. If you're watching the recording, I'd love for you to talk to others once you're done reading that. So what's a word or a phrase that sticks out to you after you read that? And I'm going to pause and let you read that. Ooh, thank you. So many of you here, some of the words I'm seeing in the chat are people are resonating with the idea of empowering students. I think coming out of the pandemic, a lot of us were thinking about how we build in students that can work independent of us. These practices are related to that. Someone talked about ensuring understanding. Actually, several of you did that. Like these practices are built to ensure understanding in our students, to empower our student. Um, a lot of talk of interweaving within that. And so, as we're thinking about the standards of mathematical practice, these practices, as I've talked about, are built on the things that came before. They don't replace them, they are just deepening the work of those process standards, the procedural fluency strands that interweave to design the work. As I've said, the practices are also in science. Science has a dimension that's called science and engineering practices, so we're not alone. And having practices that empower students, that build on reasoning and communication. And if you look at those words, reasoning and communication, those are the 21st workforce skills that our students are going to need as they become productive members of our communities, as they enter the workforce, as they enter college. And that is our job as a K-12 math classrooms, is to build those in our students as we're building knowledge of mathematics. And so we've been doing in other webinar series, there's a recording that I'll link to on the MCTM YouTube channel, some professional development on the combination of those math and science standards, and looking at how they overlap. And I've been working with Angie in science, and we've actually been working with all the STEM people at the Minnesota Department of Ed to look at how all of those practices interweave. And so if you're interested in thinking about that, I'll link to a webinar that we did on the math and science practices. I've already talked about a couple of the practices as we're going along. So a lot of you talked about empowering students, and this is a gift that I use a lot because I think all of us, if we've taught, have at times or a lot of times felt like we are trying to drag students into liking and doing mathematics. And if I could talk about the 8 practices from my point of view, the 8 practices are about how do we dismantle this experience in our classroom where we feel like we're literally dragging students to liking math. And so for me, this is the best definition of the math practices. In our standards, we use MP to abbreviate math practices. Nationally, they use SMP standards for mathematical practice. It's totally Googleable, something that you can Google. The math practices describe the varieties of expertise that mathematics educators, that's us as teachers, at all levels should seek to develop in our students. As I look at that, one of the things that comes to my mind is this is not something I'm telling my students to do. It's I'm creating the conditions that allow for students over their K-12 experience to have many, many experiences where they practice and develop these 8 practices as in the learning of mathematics. So we're going to be talking in this webinar series about how we create those conditions to do that. These are pictures of Minnesota students in 2 different classrooms across Minnesota. One of them is from my personal classroom, and another one is from the Osseo School District. And we know already we have assets in our state of students who are engaging in and are empowered to engage in being thinkers and doers of math. And so my wondering is in these classrooms, how did we create the conditions? So this is what the classrooms look like on a daily basis. I would say these 2 classrooms look like not when you Google math student, what you saw in those pictures, but what you see when you Googled 21st work century math students and what they were doing. So we're going to explore in this webinar series, and if you want, you can start that exploration now with a lot of the things that I've linked to. How do we create those conditions for Minnesota students to engage in those 8 math practices. We're not going to be upset if they don't have it done perfectly, because the way we get better at these things is to practice those things. NCTM, since these have been out for almost 15 years, has released a lot of information on what mathematics classrooms will look like. This is one example that of what math instruction looks more like. As we think about the future world that we're preparing our students for and what math instruction looks less like. And I wanted to connect it with just a real life issue, because a lot of times there's a belief, I don't think people on this webinar believe this, but there's a belief in a lot of people out in the community that you either have math or you don't have math. And this was a picture that was taken and posted this week by Simon Gregg of his child, 4-year-old child. And his 4-year-old child was playing with Cuisinart rods and made this and said to his dad, hey, these two things are the same. A 4-year-old creating this and saying these two things are the same. As I looked at this as a math teacher who has taught middle school and high school, I thought, wow, there's a lot of conceptual understanding of mathematics, what it means for things to be equal. My next question for the student would be, and Simon said this when he shared this in social media, like, well, what do you mean they're the same? How do you know they're the same? And having students center their reasoning. Students, and the research says that we are born mathematicians, because mathematics is the study of patterns and relationships. And mathematicians do 3 things. We notice things, we describe them using the way that we have to describe them in the world, and then we generalize those things. And the math practices are those things that are built to do that process of mathematics. I love this picture. I can imagine using this picture even in calculus. If there's calculus teachers in this space, there's some things that I think about when I think about that. This child and parent actually put an equal sign in there. This is a 4-year-old. They've never been introduced necessarily to the equal sign, but the parent was working on this idea using the student's natural way of looking at things to start to build this idea of things that have the same hold the same value, and describing what that looks like. That idea is built into, because we start as 4-year-olds with some ideas of math, and our new standards are built on a progression that includes these math practices within them. Our students in elementary school are not going to be perfect with these 8 practices, but they will get more and more sophisticated in the use of them if, as a state of math educators, we commit to building these in our students. I have a favorite person to follow on social media. They're on Facebook and Instagram. They go by Mr. Pentagon. If you're on either of those platforms, I highly recommend following Mr. Pentagon. He posts a lot of visuals on a lot of different things. And one that I've kept a lot of them, I'll let you know that, is how children learn math. And for me, this is a picture of the practices. Our students are given some type of experience first, might be for 3 minutes, might be for 20 minutes, where they get to struggle with the mathematics. And then as a classroom, we're formalizing that learning with students later. But for students to gauge in the practices, for us to empower students to work independent of us, we must build in them these 8 practices that we're going to learn about over the course of this year. If you've ever thought your students you're dragging them into math, I would challenge you to think about, how can I develop the 8 practices in my classroom? They work for our current standards and benchmarks, and will work for our future standards and benchmarks as well. So this is dimension 1 of our standards. We're going to break each of these down in each of these half-hour webinars. One of the things you could do before our next webinar is to go into our new standards, and the last 4 pages, pages 117 to 120, I have that listed on the document, include in there a copy where they step out these all 8 of them and tell you about each of them. If you have time, I'd love for you to read those 4 pages prior to coming to any future webinars and start to say, what do I know about this? What do I think about it? Spend some time struggling with it before you come to the webinar, and then we'll unpack it together. The last thing I want to tell you is the other things that is in the front matter of our standards that we'll be talking about a lot this year. I've already been talking about it, is the definition of mathematical rigor. I am going to be doing a webinar next week. Sometime this weekend, it will be up on the MCTM event page to sign up for that free webinar of what is mathematical rigor. I would call it the umbrella that goes over all the practices and all the standards in our standards. And it's us transforming our classrooms to have all these things are important. Skills and procedures are important. Application is important, and conceptual understanding as well. And so if you take a look at this, you will be, and then conceptual understanding is going to be the big focus of the PLC this year. We'll be working on other parts of this definition in future years of the PLC to get ready for the year 27-28 when the 2022 standards will first be fully implemented. Everything that I have shared in this is either currently in these folders or in these docs, or will be at some point. I will share what I can. If I can share my PowerPoint, I will. There are things that get in the way of that sometime as well. I am committed by next Monday to try and get the recording up on the MCTM YouTube channel. And you can share that information with you. Just a reminder, in there is a document that says, how could you use this to just introduce this to others? This webinar was simply to say, what are the math practices? What are they about? And then we'll break down each of the 8 practices. Our last webinar will be about implementing all of them and how and what that looks like as we're doing them. So again, I would love for you to read those things. I also want to tell you that if you are somebody that wants to go deeper with this, this is going to be one of the MCTM Minnesota Math Leaders Book Club selections this year. I'm going to be reaching out to the author to see if the author would be interested in joining us sometime this year. But there is a friend of mine who's a math leader in the Anoka School District, Megan Schmidt. She reached out to him on Twitter and said, Mike, and Megan is a secondary teacher, a high school teacher. And this book says it's for people teaching young children, K2 students. But she said the vignettes in this book help me understand the math practices better than anything that I've read. Each of the chapters in this book is about one of the 8 math practices. I will be reading it this year, and it will be one of the books. I haven't read it yet, but I continually hear great things about this book. So I am a middle school and high school teacher, and I will be looking at that as well. So the goal of this 10-part series is, how do we create the conditions so all of our classrooms, our students feel empowered and feel like they are mathematicians. Our next webinar 2 weeks from today will be on Math Practice 1. And I am going to stick around and answer questions. I'm going to turn off my sharing my screen in a moment. If you have questions for the next 15 minutes, I might leave the recording on, but I'm not